You're watching Newzroom. Let's pick up on this conversation now. Controversy that sanctioned or U.S.-sanctioned Russian ship Lady R picked up weapons from a naval base near Cape Town late last year has led President Cyril Ramaphosa to establish an independent inquiry to look into the allegations. Now, the Democratic Alliance says it will fight to get the report released to the public once it has been completed. Let's get some context now, and we're joined by the Democratic Alliance Member of Parliament, Emma Louise Powell. Emma, good morning to you, and thank you for your time. I read the story in the Sunday Times yesterday. I've got to tell you, I couldn't understand what the spokesperson for the president was trying to explain there as to why this report should not be released publicly, except to say, of course, that there are secrecy issues. Do you understand what the reasoning is for not wanting to publicize this report once the investigations are concluded?
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. I think that the ANC are desperately grasping at straws. I think that they know that something is afoot, and there would be no reason for the president's spokesperson to try and conceal or to announce that the ANC will be concealing the report if there wasn't anything to hide. And we all know that hiding this report from the public view will in fact rob the people of South Africa and the world from the opportunity to understand the full facts of this matter. And refusing to disclose the complete picture of how the ANC-led government has potentially allegedly smuggled weapons to Russia will also undermine the very purpose of the investigation. This is an investigation that is in South Africa's public interest.
Will it go some distance to appease the public when this president's spokesperson says what is important is that whatever that report says has been done wrong by any department that may possibly have been linked to this, the necessary sanctions will then be applied, or basically consequences will then follow. Is that going to appease the public?
Well, what's at risk here is some of South Africa's most strategic trade partnerships. For example, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. We know that that is at risk. Now, if an investigation or a commission of inquiry is undertaken, but it's done under a veil of secrecy, and the South African people do not understand what the outcomes are, and that us as members of parliament on the opposition benches who have a constitutional duty to ensure that remedial action is undertaken, if this report is conducted under this veil of secrecy, how is it that any of us are supposed to ensure that the necessary consequence management and remedial actions are taken? So I think that it almost renders the entire investigation moot should it be conducted A, under a veil of secrecy, and B, should the findings of the report be redacted from the public view. Perhaps the ANC are intending on appeasing their American counterparts by saying, look, we conducted an investigation, here are our findings, we'll take the relevant action. But we know that there have been various commissions of inquiry. We know, for example, with the Zondo Commission, none of the recommendations have yet been implemented, and those were public. So how are we to believe that if a report or an inquiry is undertaken under a veil of secrecy, that there will be any consequence management when public reports lack the relevant consequence management? This is deeply concerning, and I think that it points to President Cyril Ramaphosa and his cabinet realizing that there is potentially more at stake for South Africa, and potentially the actions of those involved in December were more nefarious than what the public realized.
Let's then sum up this conversation in this way, Emma. This entire controversy around the Lady R ship, is it ill-fated anyway? Why am I saying this? The U.S. has now come out, this is Washington, to say we did not sanction our ambassador to South Africa to come out and say the things that he said. On the other hand, you now have a much more emboldened South African government through the minister in the presidency who came onto this show just this past Friday to tell us that they actually are going to call for more action against the U.S. ambassador should this investigation unearth nothing. So, is this much ado about nothing?
Absolutely not. What I can tell you, and it's now in the public domain, is that as far back as February this year, the U.S. Secretary for Treasury, so essentially the U.S. Finance Minister, had raised concerns via bilateral discussions with Cabinet. Those discussions continued when Sydney Mufamadi led the South African delegation to Washington in April. The United States had given the South African government a number of chances to investigate, to deal with allegations, to deal with the intelligence that the United States has, and nothing happened. It was only when Ambassador Brigati essentially drew his sword in the public domain that we finally saw Cyril Ramaphosa taking action, and now 6 months after the fact, an inquiry has been initiated, but now on Friday we find out that this is going to be done under a veil of secrecy. This is absolutely not much to do about nothing. South Africa's most important strategic trade partnerships with the West are at risk. AGOA is at risk. This potentially could deprive South Africans of more than 100,000 jobs, more than 40 billion rands worth of trade. This is very real, tangible consequences for the people of South Africa. I think that if the South African government had nothing to hide, that this investigation would be conducted in public. Witnesses from all quarters of civil society and government would be able to present their evidence in public, as happened with the Zondo Commission, and that the findings of the report would be made public and the necessary consequence management would be meted from there. I think that the greatest indication yet that this is in fact not much ado about nothing is the fact that the presidency is now trying to conduct this investigation under a veil of secrecy.
Let's get an update on the Democratic Alliance's court action. This is where you are now trying to either block Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, from coming to South Africa, given that he has an arrest warrant, an ICC arrest warrant on his head. If that is not going to happen, then the South African government must tell us, in particular the president, as to whether President Putin is still coming to South Africa. Where is that court process?
So the Democratic Alliance launched court action last Monday, and the intention of our court action is to secure what we call a declaratory order from the court ahead of time as a preemptive step to say that should Putin arrive in South Africa, that government will indeed arrest him. We know that there's a desperate scramble going on behind the scenes to potentially find an alternative venue for the BRICS summit. We know that there's discussions around potentially moving the meeting to either China or Mozambique, neither of which are party to the Rome Statute or to the International Criminal Court. And so the DA's court action is to make sure that we don't see a repeat of the 2015 al-Bashir saga, where the president of that nation at the time, as part of the Brotherhood of African Leaders, was allowed to escape arrest in South Africa, despite South Africa's implementation act and being party to the Rome Statute. So we're essentially trying to prevent a repeat of what happened in 2015. I do think that we'll see some more fancy footwork from the ANC ahead of time, given that the world is currently watching, and that it would be treacherous for South Africa to allow an alleged war criminal who's accused of abducting children to come and conduct multilateral business within South Africa. So the DA's court action is proceeding, and we hope to obtain that declarator ahead of the August summit.
That court action proceeding, as you say, despite the criticism against you, quite harsh, might I add, that this is typical DA, which is acting outside of the interests of the country, in that you are unpatriotic. Do you take on board that criticism, or is that just water off a duck's back?
I find it astonishing. The DA are trying to protect the interests of the South African people. South Africa has a very strategic role to play from a geopolitical perspective, both on the African continent and on the global stage. Let's take it down to the brass tacks. Let's look at numbers. Let's look at how this affects ordinary South Africans. So, for example, South Africa currently does 0.3% worth of trade with Russia. Russia and China collectively accounted for 6.2% of foreign direct investment into South Africa in recent years. Conversely, foreign direct investment into South Africa from the three main Western markets, the European Union, the UK, and the US, accounted for 77% of foreign direct investment. That's businesses who base their headquarters or operations here. They create jobs and they put food on the table for ordinary South Africans. Currently, the EU and the UK account for 47% of South Africa's exports. This is about trade, but it's also about our constitutional values. Now, in terms of our foreign policy as a nation, we need to ensure that our constitution forms the bedrock of our positions and the people that we form friendships and partnerships with in the global community. So this is about trade, it's about jobs, it's about bread and butter issues. Yeah. And South Africa is going to be damaged by this. So the DA is not being unpatriotic. We're essentially the only party in the arena right now being patriotic.
Emma Louise Powell, thank you very much for your time. This is what politics is about. She is the Democratic Alliance's Shadow Minister on International Relations.